You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
And I'm Martin Robbins.
This week, what does the king of Substack, Sam Freedman, think about this whole abundance thing anyway? But first, let's talk about the tube because, we know you like that sort of thing. So Martin, let's start this week by talking once again about the most important place in the universe.
Bedfordshire.
Close, Martin, literally relatively close. I'm talking about London, of course, because this week I bring you very exciting news, as someone might have finally figured out how to pay for the extension to the Bakerloo London Underground line.
I'll be honest, James, I get uncomfortable when this podcast isn't about my petty local grievances, but all right, tell me why London needs even more tubes.
So essentially, you can see the problem just by looking at the tube map. So a century ago, I think it was 1906, the Bakerloo line was built to cross all the way from northwest London to southeast London. But if you follow the brown line all the way down the map, you'll see that they got to Waterloo, just south of the river, and then went down a little bit further to Lambeth North, and then to Elephant and Castle, and then just stopped building. And to this day, there's this basically enormous bit of South London that is a total tube desert.
So it's basically like the Bakerloo line was made by taxi drivers, right? So you've got like the Victoria line going south down to Brixton. You've got the Jubilee line that hugs the river, kind of trying to stay as close to the north as it possibly can. But there's like a whole quadrant, I guess, like from 3 to 6 on the clock face where it kind of around Camberwell, Peckham, that sort of area where it's just bizarrely devoid of coloured lines, like somebody ran out of coloured pens.
Absolutely. I think Camberwell is, in fact, like the furthest place in certainly central London from a tube station. There's just nothing there. So, as long as the Bakerloo line has been around, there's been this plan to try and extend it further into South London because that would be more fair. And a few years ago, TfL, they came up with what I think was a pretty good plan to extend the line, build basically under Old Kent Road. They wanted to add 2 new tube stations there. They wanted to take it to New Cross Gate, which is, again, just further into southeast London. That's already a pretty big train station that goes to other places. And then they want to take the Bakerloo onto Lewisham, which is like, I don't know if you've seen Lewisham recently, but it's like Manhattan almost. It's like a little skyscraper cluster hidden in South London. And they've been building loads of great residential skyscrapers and tall buildings there. So they want to take the Bakerloo all the way there. And TfL has even come up with basically a phase 2, where it would then connect to, it's called the Hayes line, another railway line with 10 more train stations on it. I think they must currently go into like London Bridge or something. But basically the idea would be the Bakerloo would also go there, share the tracks and connect up even more of like Bromley, southeast London, proper rural southeast London, and connect it straight into central London.
Your concept of rural in southeast London may be very different to mine in Bedfordshire, James. I have to be honest, like I actually really struggle to visualize Lewisham at this point. It's like one of those places, like I know it's a place, I've heard the name, I cannot for the life of me imagine what it looks like, what's there, anything like that. Most of my knowledge of that part of London is basically from Monopoly. So I know that Old Kent Road is the cheapest property on the Monopoly board. So if you can get a tube station there, it's fantastic. You can rent a house for what, £10 a month? And that's going to shoot up if they get a tube station open.
Well, one reason that's relevant to this podcast is because it would make it feasible to build tons and tons of housing. If there's more tube connections, more people can live there, or more people can, get around without needing to use local buses, which are already very busy, or use a car. And the weird thing about Old Kent Road more generally is just how low density it is at the moment. Like you go down there on the bus, as I've done many, many times, and you see there's normal sort of rows of houses and flats of 2 or 3 stories either side, but then you get these just enormous superstores and industrial estates. You're honestly not that far from central London. If there was a tube, you could be in Westminster in sort of 10 minutes. But you get these like there's a massive Tesco's there, which has a big surface car park. There's a big B&Q with, again, just a big car park. So it's very, very suburban. In fact, I remember 12 years ago, I took a bus and then I had to walk for about half an hour through one of these industrial estates to go to the Yodel depot down there in the rain to find some Christmas presents.
It was a glamour.
But as I say, as the crow flies, this is really close to central London. So put some tube stations in and you could replace all of this sort of industrial land, all of this sort of low density stuff with loads of new flats and create loads of new homes for people to live in.
I mean, it sounds great, James, but you're being a bit blasé about this. I assume there are downsides as well, right? So, I mean, what about the historic character of the Yodel depot? And I assume this is going to cost a lot of money as well.
Yeah, I think one estimate, and I'll get to who came up with this estimate in a minute, put it at about £13 billion, which is it's not that far off of what Crossrail cost in the end, which was 19 billion. So yeah, pretty pricey.
Yeah, and there's no way the government's going to pay for that given, the current situation with the national finances. They've just paid for the Elizabeth line, HS2's costing a small fortune, and things like Northern Powerhouse Rail are going to be front of the queue, one would imagine.
So yeah, this is the amazing thing, Martin. Under this new plan, this new set of ideas that I'm going to tell you about now, the government doesn't have to pay a penny. And even better than that, if this plan is taken up, it could actually help pay for new rail and transport infrastructure in the north, not just North London, but the north of England and all the other poorer parts of the country. It could help level up the rest of the country, or regional rebalance, as I think Labour has rebranded levelling up. And also, it would obviously extend the tube network. So this is like a win, 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 win.
Have you got quite enough wins there,
Yeah.
James? I mean, it sounds like too winning to be true. Did you find a magic money tree or something? Like, how is this going to work?
No, there's no magic money tree, Martin, because this isn't an edgy left wing podcast that is afraid of admitting there are trade offs in life. We're a boring, I don't know, centrist, maybe centre left podcast. We believe economics is real.
Controversial stuff, James. Economics is real. What will we be telling the kids next?
Well, this is the thing. So that's why I'm delighted to say, Martin, that the actual one weird trick that could do all of this amazing, useful stuff is actually a really deep, in the weeds, technocratic reform that the government could do, and it would make a really big impact.
Okay, well, in the weeds, technocratic reforms, ideally incremental. This is the kind of stuff that we can get behind. So tell me more. What's the big deal here?
So I know we've talked about them a lot on this podcast in recent weeks, but this is another great idea, I think, from the Labour Together think tank. So we've spoke about them a few times recently. I think we talked about their digital ID proposals. We've talked about their regional rebalancing proposals, but they keep publishing really interesting stuff. And this new paper is called London Unchained, and it's co-authored by James Howitt from Labour Together itself, John Myers and Kane Emerson from the YIMBY Alliance, and Jack Shaw from the Productivity Institute at the University of Manchester. So essentially, the big idea with this paper is that the way we pay for the Bakerloo line extension is for the government to, wait for it, not actually give London any money. Instead, we should give the Mayor of London a whole bunch of new powers so he can raise the money himself. The teach a man to fish approach to public finances.
So we've spoken before about how the Mayor of London is actually a fairly powerless office, relatively speaking, right? So it's surprisingly neutered, even if you compare it to other cities in the UK. And the UK is not exactly a country that's known for embracing decentralization compared to a lot of other parts of the world.
Absolutely. So Britain, is so centralised that local authorities can do very little on their own. Whenever they want to pay for something, they have to go to Whitehall with a begging bowl and say, "Can we have some money, please?" Like the craziest example of that, just off the top of my head, was the chessboards thing. Do you remember when Rishi Sunak said there was going to be £1 million for chessboards in parks around the country, and there was a whole application process where a local council could write to the government and say, "Can we have some money for a chessboard, please?" Anyway, so this is a crazy situation more generally, and this paper sort of puts it in perspective because it compares London and what the Mayor of London can do to Paris, where the mayor has much greater fiscal autonomy. So Paris, for example, it can impose a small payroll tax to raise money to spend on public goods and so on. And the city itself, it can keep hold of parking revenues locally to spend them as they will. So what the authors of this paper basically advocate is that we should have more of these sorts of powers for London. So, for example, maybe London could be allowed to raise its council tax a bit as long as the money is spent on infrastructure.
This is where I sort of run into the challenges, though, right? Because
Mm.
raising council tax, to me, I know it's very popular at the moment, the idea that, oh, we should just raise taxes and pay for public services and infrastructure. And I get the temptation, but people are going to revolt if council taxes go any higher and they still don't see the value for it. I guess you could have something like a tourist tax, but again, that's probably not going to raise billions and billions of pounds, although it's sort of a no-brainer for London to do. But I guess autonomy is fantastic, but if the plan is just tax people more, then I'm a little bit disappointed. Surely there's something a bit cleverer than that in the works.
So there is, Martin, but I will say, in defence of tourist taxes, because this is something that's raised in the paper, I think a tourist tax is a sort of no-brainer. And even if it does raise a relatively small amount of money, whether that's, £100 million or £1 billion, that's still quite a lot of money you can spend on stuff. And the thing I love about tourist taxes, and the reason I think that's such a good idea, is because nobody thinks about them ahead of time. So I don't know about you, every time I go on
Yeah.
holiday, you get to the front desk, you check in at the hotel, and then someone says, "Oh, and an extra £40, please," and you're like, "Oh, for fuck's sake," because you just haven't thought about it. And we should be in on this. We should be screwing London's tourists on this as well. Otherwise, it's just not fair.
I'm always in favor of taxes that other people pay, James.
Oh, I mean, it also makes sense because tourists use a lot of London's infrastructure as well, so it would help them pay their way. But anyway, so one of the big conceptual tools at the heart of this paper is basically giving the mayor a bigger toolkit with which to do what's called land value capture. So this is the idea that when, for example, you build a new railway line and suddenly all of that land around it becomes more valuable because the railway line has created demand and people can actually live there. So the idea is, I guess, that the local authority, or in this case, the Mayor of London, can take a bit of that extra value uplift through some sort of new tax or levy and so on, and bring that money in to help pay for the railway itself.
And this is an idea that has a very fine history in the UK, right? So this is basically what drove the creation of Metroland, which
Mm.
honestly I would love to do a whole episode on someday. But it's one of the most fascinating stories of how the London suburbs became what they are today. So basically, in the 19th century, railway companies bought lands that might be needed for their railway. And if you imagine, if you're trying to build a railway, you can't just build the exact land that the tracks are sitting on. You've got to buy the whole field or the whole chunk of land, and then you use part of it for your railway. And then you need to get rid of all the surplus land that's left over. And most railway companies used to have to just offload that land as quickly as possible once they'd built the railway. But the Metropolitan Railway had a special exemption for this for reasons that are lost to history, or that I just couldn't Google thoroughly enough before this podcast episode. They had a special clause that meant they could hold on to the land if it might be necessary for future railway use. And as you say, once you've built the railway, the land is more valuable. You can use that value to start, paying for the infrastructure, and they could sell off that now more expensive land and recoup some of the money to pay for the railway.
Absolutely. And basically, I think what the idea is here is to let the Mayor of London do almost exactly the same thing with a sort of wider way of extracting the cash in the end. But fundamentally, the argument is the Bakerloo line extension will make all of the land in South London more valuable as it will be better connected. And therefore, it should be the city itself and not just the property owners who should be able to capture part of that uplift and therefore pay for the train.
Yeah, and this can have massive consequences. So, right back at the turn of the 20th century, the Metropolitan Railway, they had a land committee that would just sell off the land to builders and so on as it became available. And it was quite sort of disorganized and disjointed, and they'd sell off random plots, and some of them would be successful, some of them less so. But around the time of the First World War, there's a chap called Robert Selby who basically says, hang on, let's be a bit more organized and let's group up some of this land and build housing estates near the railway and build it ourselves. And they ran into all kinds of legal issues and shenanigans. Technically, as a railway company, they weren't supposed to be allowed to do it. And they were a bit concerned that they were going to fall foul of Parliament, who might take away those clauses that would allow them to do what they wanted with the land. So they basically created a spin off company that just happened to have all of the same directors as the Metropolitan Railway. And they start building houses. And at this point, the Metropolitan Railway, which eventually obviously becomes the Metropolitan Line, goes all the way out to Buckinghamshire, Aylesbury, the Chilterns, all the way through Wembley, Harrow, and in vast new suburbs are built. The whole area becomes known, thanks to a 1915 marketing campaign, as Metroland. And it's kind of wild you can't really overstate just how massively culturally significant Metroland is to the first half of the 20th century in Britain. So this coincides with the era of cheap mortgages. This is the first time that home ownership massively rises in England, and the sort of expectation that middle class people will own their own home. And basically, the entire concept of middle class suburbia is created in this moment. It inspires works by John Betjeman, Evelyn Waugh, any sitcom that you've seen based in the suburbs in the late 20th century, The Good Life, One Foot in the Grave, Hyacinth Bouquet. all of this is kind of inspired by Metroland. It's why Wembley Stadium is the home of British football and not just a bunch of fields, effectively. It's an astonishing transformation that happened basically in large part because of a fairly obscure clause and the ability to capture value back from land after building infrastructure.
My favourite thing about the Metropolitan line going all the way to like Aylesbury or wherever the hell it was I think they even had dining cars back in the day,
Yeah.
which is just it's hard to imagine given the tubes today and how packed it gets, how that would have worked. But anyway,
My other favorite Metropolitan line fact is that the Paris Metro is named after the Metropolitan line.
oh really?
Yeah, exactly. So when Paris wanted to build its own tube line in the
Mm.
1870s, they were inspired by the Metropolitan line in London. So they called their first tube line the Metropolitain, which is metropolitan with a French accent. And then from that, they shortened it to Metro, and that just became the name of the whole metro system. So basically, every metro line in the world is named after the original Metropolitan line in London.
Oh my god, Martin, I'm really tempted to say let's just cancel the podcast. Let's just do tube facts.
We'll save that for the Christmas
Yeah.
edition of the episode. Just tube facts for like 2 hours.
So subscribe now, listeners, if you want. Yeah, we'll do tube facts at Christmas. But anyway, so Martin, let's get back to land value capture because that's what we're talking about now. So what Metroland did, I think that's a pretty extreme case of how you could do land value capture. But there are all sorts of other things that you could do, and I think this is probably more in the vein of what Labour Together are thinking, if I can sort of put words in their mouth. So they want to, for example, they think development corporations should be given more powers to acquire land at low value rather than let the property owners hike the value once they realise someone wants to put a train there. I think that's actually part of the planning bill, or there's something in the planning bill that could help with that. They think we could have a tax, or the mayor could tax undeveloped land, or perhaps central government could, or something like that, to sort of force people to build more densely around sort of rail corridors. And then there is just putting a levy on local businesses. I think when the Elizabeth line was built, there was something like a 2% levy put on business rates. I guess more complicated than that. I don't really understand business rates. Basically, all the businesses in London, they paid a little bit more, and all of this added up to basically paying for 70% of the Elizabeth line on its own. But that was a one-off for the Elizabeth line. So I think what the authors here are proposing to pay for the Bakerloo extension and indeed other infrastructure is that these sort of powers should just be available to London more generally.
Yeah, and it's weird that we seem to keep doing this kind of stuff in Britain as a one-off, like very, very reluctantly, almost as like central government is sort of an angry dad offering the keys of the car to like the tearaway young teenager or something like, I suppose I'll trust you with it for one evening, but God forbid you do any damage to it. And yet over literally hundreds of years, like we've shown that if you give that kind of autonomy to authorities, if you let them figure out how to capture the value from it, usually people in these areas can figure out good ways to do it. But I guess you also need the right incentives, right? So you can imagine London having these powers, but then being too afraid to use them because, who wants to raise taxes or anger NIMBYs who are concerned about the historic architecture of the Lewisham B&Q?
Absolutely. So the authors also say that in tandem with handing London more powers to raise its own money, the government should basically refuse to help London or other rich areas of the country, so basically the southeast, build infrastructure on its own unless there's a quote-unquote national reason to do so. And then central government could sort of shift the incentives on the mayor by doing things top-down. So, for example, you can increase housing requirements that are imposed from the top. We've talked on this show about like local plans and the London plan. If the government could say, we need to build even more houses, that would then put pressure on the mayor and the and councillors in different boroughs to build more. So these policies could capture more uplift. An example of this is Bromley. So Bromley, like we've mentioned, is the borough that would probably, if they built this Bakerloo extension all the way to Bromley through phase 1 and 2 of the extension, it would benefit massively from the connectivity, but it's also the least densely populated London borough at the moment. It's quite NIMBY-ish, as you might expect. So you need to basically incentivise them from both Westminster and indeed the Mayor of London to sort of say, hey, you've got to densify if you're going to get this new tube line, because then everyone wins. So like we say, we could give development corporations more powers, and I'm sure there's various other tools as well. I think one important thing that the government should have to do, and this is just me freestyling now, this isn't in the paper, is I think that we should force force the London boroughs to hand more powers up to the mayor, to make the mayor a more powerful office. I've said in this podcast before, I prefer if the mayor of London was basically a little dictator, but I accept that as probably more of a controversial opinion. So I just think the borough councils, they're too likely to say no, so we should give the mayor unchecked power.
I think I'm sold on most of this. Maybe not the little dictator part, but we can argue about that later. But here's the thing, James. We're talking about Bromley, Lewisham, Peckham, the heartlands of, as you called it, rural southeast London. But why should the majority of our listeners who aren't from London actually care about this, James? What's in it for the rest of us?
Well, I'm struggling to imagine anything of note happening outside of London, Martin, but I'll do my best because basically this is a really interesting plan because here's the twist. It's not just about building the Bakerloo line extension. What this paper is really about, it's about regional rebalancing. It's about levelling up the north, as we used to say.
I mean, you keep saying this phrase regional rebalancing. I'm just going to say right now, I don't think it's going to take off. Partly because kind of leveling up has poisoned the well on the whole concept, but also, come on, regional rebalancing. Like, surely these think tanks could hire a copywriter to do a better job than that. I hear there are good freelancers available who cover this kind of area and would be delighted to help out. But anyway, we're back to leveling up again, James. But how does this specifically work?
Okay, so the fundamental problem is when you're government in Westminster, you've got a lot of different things to fund. You've got a lot of different trade-offs and priorities. So, people come to you and ask for some money. So, I've got to pay for some new fighter jets because of Putin or something like that.
That bloody Putin again.
But then Northerners turn up and they want a Northern Powerhouse Railway.
Yeah, or a wall to keep out the White Walkers.
Exactly. And then London turn up and they want a Bakerloo line extension. And then at the same time, the Chancellor's there, going through the finances and they want to maintain an iron grip on fiscal credibility. They can't just give money out willy-nilly. Otherwise, you end up in like a Liz Truss situation.
Yeah, and we don't want the Queen to die again.
Yeah, so I think this sort of explains why historically the North has always been screwed over because much as there's been plans and plans and plans over the years to extend the Bakerloo line, the North has had it just as bad. The number of times there's been a plan published, which is, and here's how we fix the railways between Manchester and Leeds and make things faster. There's been plans and they've been cancelled, there've been plans and they've been cancelled. You can go back and listen to our episode on Northern Powerhouse to hear more about some of those plans. But anyway, so fundamentally the problem is this. So whenever you're trying to allocate who gets £1 billion of public spending for various infrastructure and so on, the South basically always wins because it's richer, or more people use trains. So whenever you do sort of value for money calculations on which bits of the country would benefit most from this government cash, it almost always works out as better value to upgrade infrastructure in the South, which pisses off the North.
Well, yeah, and this is just going to compound over time, right? Because the more you develop an area, the more the economy grows there, the more people use the infrastructure there, and then the more apparent value you'll get from developing it even further. So the rich get richer and everyone else can sort of go swivel.
Absolutely. A fun example of this was published by the economist Tim Lunig a few weeks ago. He looked at passenger numbers and facilities and compared Darlington Station, so Darlington, Grand Town in the north, with Catford Station in London. And Catford is like just a tiny little suburb of London. But if you look at the numbers alone and you want the most bang for your buck, it would actually make more sense, according to Tim's argument, to upgrade Catford rather than Darlington, which obviously wouldn't be very politically saleable. But the great thing about this plan is that if London is paying for its own infrastructure, if the southeast, if the rich parts of the country are paying their own way and doing their own thing with their own sort of fiscal autonomy, then suddenly these trade-offs don't exist. The government can then choose to say, well, no, we'll spend the money on the north, so everyone wins. And then the other benefit is in terms of national headline debt figures. Again, I don't really understand, but there's some complex accounting rules that because London is doing its own thing and it's not going on the government books, that doesn't then affect government spending quite as much. So basically, like I say, it's a win-win-win. We can remain fiscally credible. The government can subsidise infrastructure in the north. London can pay for its own stuff. And we can finally get a Bakerloo line extension, which will connect South London and right the historic injustice of not being able to catch a tube from Lewisham to, central London or something like that.
That's 7 wins in one podcast segment, James. Well done. And I guess the other win is that maybe in the 2070s, we'll be watching sitcoms set in the leafy suburbs of Leeds or Manchester.
Okay, Martin, so that was a long segment this week, so we're going to skip the second segment, but you've promised me you've got something very exciting for next week, but we're just going to tease that. So if you've been enjoying the show, if you enjoy chats about infrastructure and building things and growth and so on, make sure you're subscribed to the pod to get this directly in your podcast app, wherever that may be. And if you are enjoying the pod, go to your podcast app now, give us 5 stars so you can feed our enormous egos, and also share the show, post it on social media, send it to a friend on WhatsApp. Say, hey, you're a nerd, you like stuff like this, have a listen to this. Anyway, so in addition to doing this show, Martin, we both write Substack newsletters every week. Have you been writing anything this week?
No, I've mostly been suffering from food poisoning, James, as you may be able to tell from the fact I've been sweating my way through this podcast recording. So it's not been the greatest week for content, if I'm honest. But what I have been working on, which will come up next week, is the true story of how NIMBY forces, James, have been infiltrating one of our great British institutions. So more on that next week and probably on the podcast as well. What about yourself, James? Who have you been annoying this week?
Oh, I've not been annoying anyone. I've got a piece that's 85% written. In fact, next week I'll be publishing 2 things. So I've got a
Wow.
whole write-up about this paper, the London Unchained paper. By the way, we've got links to the London Unchained paper, so you can read more on abundancepod.com. I've also written my take on it. I think mine's a bit more fun. I don't have to be as important sounding as a big official policy paper. So you can find that on my Substack. But I've also got another thing coming up later this week, which should have gone out last week, but I didn't quite get finished. So yeah, you can find links to our Substacks at abundancepod.com. And finally, Martin, let's get to this week's interview, and it's a very exciting one this week.
Yes, it's the person that you've apparently styled the king of Substack, although that does kind of raise the question of who the, queen, prince and princesses of Substack are.
I've always considered Matt Goodwin a Substack princess, much as Disney has its princesses.
Snow White. Yes, but anyway, moving swiftly on. Our guest this week is the author of the amazing book Failed States, about Britain and its institutions and how to fix them, and the author or past co-author of the brilliantly named Comment is Freed Substack with his father Lawrence Freedman. It's Sam Freedman.
So let's have a listen to that and find out what he thinks of this whole abundance thing. So we're delighted to be joined now by Sam Freedman, the king of Substack. That's what I'm calling you, Sam. And we wanted to talk to you on the show this week because you published a very interesting article recently all about abundance and the 2 sort of major abundance texts that have been published so far, Ezra Klein's and Derek Thompson's book Abundance, as well as Mark Dunkelman's Why Nothing Works. So, you're a very astute observer of politics. So what's your big take on abundance?
So there's a lot of it that I'm attracted to for the same reason that you guys are. I can see, like you, that we have frustrations with our planning processes, that it takes us forever to build stuff, etc., etc. So I totally buy the principle that there are aspects of our governance systems that are overregulated, and that we need to acknowledge that, especially as liberals, we need to acknowledge that and do something about it if we're serious about economic growth. So I do buy the kind of fundamental argument. The problem I had with both books, and particularly the Klein and Thompson book, was that they don't answer their own question. They say the liberals aren't accepting the trade-offs, that they're not accepting that, yes, you might want all of these environmental benefits, all of these benefits that come from tagging on loads of extra requirements to contracts, etc., but they won't accept the cost of that. But they're almost in reverse. They don't sort of explain where the line should be drawn. They give examples of where it's clearly gone wrong, like the Californian high-speed rail that still isn't in existence. And obviously we've got our own example of a high-speed rail line that's gone horribly wrong too. But they don't explain what the principles that would underlie a different system of regulation should be. So we might think that it's daft to delay a housing development because of a couple of snails or whatever. But what's the right level of environmental regulation? What is right? Because before we had all of this sort of surge in regulation, there was very little environmental regulation, and we did have, very polluting examples of industry, and we did have developments built on very ecologically important areas. Same with historic buildings. Yes, you can point to examples where ridiculous kind of buildings are being listed, and you think, well, why would we want to keep that? But how far do you go on each of these principles? How extreme do we want to be? So you've got to have a principle of regulation that underlies abundance philosophy, and that's what I felt was perhaps understandably lacking from these books because they were just trying to introduce the idea. But I don't think it works without that because you don't have a criteria for which to say, okay, actually, this is the right amount of environmental regulation, etc. This is what we should be focusing on. It's just all attack on current systems.
Is part of the problem a kind of mechanistic fixation on, I guess, the mechanics of regulation and which regulations we should have rather than necessarily the larger system or the culture around regulation? Because if we pick the bat tunnel as an example, as we do
Yeah.
so often, it's not necessarily an inevitable consequence of the regulation that exists, right?
No.
Ultimately, that is the manifestation of various choices that people like Natural England and other
Yeah.
organizations have made over time, and potentially people could make different choices, but they're not necessarily incentivized to. So is that regulation kind of symptomatic of a broader culture of sort of legalism, literalism, whatever you want to call it? And if so, is that where we should be focusing more?
Well, in the article I wrote, I kind of made a tentative suggestion that perhaps one of the reasons why this is such a big issue in the US and UK versus some other countries around the world is because we have a very individualistic society and a very individualistic legal system based on individualism. And that means we take very seriously the sort of individual rights of individuals to complain and to put forward objections, even if it would otherwise be considered in the collective interest to do something. And countries that have a different kind of ethos around a more collective way of thinking. I mean, Japan is an obvious example, which is a democracy, but nevertheless still has a pretty strong sense of collective endeavor. Doesn't have that sense of individualism, easier to build stuff there. How much is that kind of deep cultural sense of how our legal systems were formed almost and how we approach those legal systems the real issue rather than the specific regulations or even the response to specific regulations?
So I suppose just to dig into that slightly, when we think of collectivism versus individualism, if we look at something like HS2, for example, which I assume is the UK example you were thinking of a high-speed rail that went
Yes.
wrong, famously that required several thousand consents responses from different organizations up and down the country. I suppose what you're coming to there is a sense that no one organization is able to speak for others. So we're not able to have a coherent view on the benefits of something, say, environmentally, even. There are multiple organizations, multiple councils as well, all sort of trying to make the same consideration at different levels. And that's the sort of the more individualistic part of
So you've
this.
got that complication, which is part of it, but you've also got a sort of cultural expectation on behalf of individuals that it's fine for their interests to override the collective. They wouldn't even necessarily think about it in those
Mm.
terms. It's just automatic. So, one of the reasons why it ended up going so off track and so over budget early on was because loads of Tory MPs complained, and then they added in loads of tunnels and loads of ways of trying to hide the sort of ugliness of the rail line from people in rural Tory constituencies, made loads of political changes in effect. And all of those people complaining to their MPs presumably felt that was entirely within their rights to do so and that they were entirely reasonable for them to do so. I don't think you would get anything like that in a society like Japan. There would just be an assumption that the railway was good for the general population, and so it would be inappropriate to put your interests above those of everybody else. But we just don't have that way of thinking. It's not how what our legal system is based on. It's not what our political system is based on. So I think there's something that even goes beyond the formal systems and processes that get in the way, and are all kind of why we have those systems and processes, because everyone feels they should be allowed to stop something if it upsets them.
Yeah, we see a perfect example with Dobbins Lane in Wendover that we talked about recently, which essentially comes down to one truck a day going up a particular residential street is deemed a problem, and therefore a farm track can't be upgraded, and therefore some flood mitigation can't be built, and therefore HS2 is delayed by however many months. So we've seen that manifest at every kind of level. Sticking, I guess, with the cultural side of things, another really interesting theme that I think is developed in Failed State possibly intentionally, possibly not, is the sense that the government has a kind of almost like something in the tech industry that we call founder syndrome, where you have this very low trust center trying to sort of micromanage what's happening at every particular point. And part of that obviously is about attitudes towards risk and a general unwillingness to take risks. And often then the legal side, the regulation becomes a sort of a fallback from that. One of the things you've argued around quite a lot is that more kind of decentralization of power. Does that require a very different attitude to risk in government? And if so, how do we promote that?
Yeah, I mean, you need to decentralize power, but you also need to decentralize reward. And I think that's one of the trickiest aspects of our system. So if you look at the US, one of the big benefits they have over us is that at city level, mayors have a huge incentive to build in many states. So this doesn't apply to every state, it doesn't apply in California and so on. But if you look at why Texas or Georgia have seen this huge urban development in the last few decades, that's because mayors are massively incentivized to build because they get local taxes. Their tax base is local and comes from people living in their city, so it gives them more power and more resources, and it gives the area more power and more resources. So it sort of allows people to buy into it. Of course, here, it sort of doesn't work like that at all. There's no differentiation in local taxation, or very little differentiation in local taxation based on how much growth you have in your area or how much you build in your area. So there's huge disincentives because you get shouted at by the people who are affected by it, and very little in the way of incentives. So if you just decentralize the power to do it, you probably wouldn't get very far. You have to also create the incentives to do so as well by decentralizing tax raising powers and accepting perhaps, and this is the really difficult bit I think for liberals, that you will have a little bit more inequality by doing so between areas, because obviously if you incentivize an area to grow, it grows, gets more money, then that was going to create a bit of inequality. But that's probably a good inequality to have in a system, because then other people will want to catch up with it.
And I think that's interesting because it speaks to one of the core drivers I kind of see of NIMBYism, which is you go to any town where lots of houses are being built, and the first thing that people are concerned about is they're not upgrading the roads, they're not providing additional clinics or schools. And so because this is done piecemeal, there isn't that trust that the other infrastructure will come. And there's this sort of fear, I guess. And I guess what you're saying is that that's coming from that same
Yeah.
lack of distributed power
Yeah,
ultimately,
it
right?
doesn't feel like you as a community are gaining anything from this. It's just more houses and more people. If there was a very clear sense of what you were gaining, new facilities, a revitalized town centre, whatever it was, because you would get more resources from the tax that would flow from that, then I think it would feel very different. But that requires a very different approach to local government that we have at the moment. If you think about Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, the places where housing would be most desirable and some of the most constrained places in terms of NIMBYism and objection to building more, those houses would be incredibly valuable. The people that would be coming in would typically be incredibly wealthy. If you got the benefits of that in your town, I think there would be a lot more incentive, and not just for the individuals, but for local politicians. They would be able to offer more. At the moment, look at the taking up upper level of local government. If you look at the regional mayors, they get very little benefit. They get a little bit of business rates retention, but generally speaking, they get very little benefit from growth in their area. But if they got a lot more benefit and they were able to then use that money to do fantastic schemes that got them re-elected, well, they've got incentives as well.
Something you wrote in one of your recent pieces, I was going to say your last piece, but you do churn out quite a few pieces. So it was a few pieces ago now, I think, was that it's hard to get people excited about nuclear fusion and driverless cars when even the most basic services don't seem to work and public spaces look ever shabbier. And I think, I mean, I really liked that line because I think it speaks to something we've talked about quite a bit here, which is this idea of the almost the national user experience. And which is essentially this idea that actually a lot of what's driving public sentiment at the moment is that a lot of small things either don't work very well or are, in your own words, shabby. Do you think there's an element to which we, and by we I mean pundits, commentators, journalists, Westminster itself, tend to almost find it easier to fixate on large abstract things, debating Brexit, or even if you look at something like the NHS, how do you fix the whole thing? And we sometimes struggle to get down to basic, simple things that actually would make a big difference and could sort of start to get some of that public sentiment moving in the right direction again?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the point I was making in that piece was around one of the problems with abundance as an argument, particularly at the moment, is that it's a very optimistic argument, that it's based on this sort of idea that everything can get way better, whereas people aren't even seeing very small incremental improvements in their lives. So if you're going to ask them to buy into a philosophy that is kind of super optimistic, you have to start with something smaller that they'll actually see and okay, well, okay, you can do something. And then they might buy into something a bit bigger. So that's kind of the argument I was making, and I think that's why I referred earlier to refurbishing town centres. It is such a big issue. You sit in any focus group basically outside of London, and you will eventually get onto why do you think this area is deteriorating? Because our town centre is so shabby, because we've got
Yeah.
vape shops and betting shops and a couple of pound shops and empty sites, and there's no sense of those kinds of centres are very important for pride. Now it's hard because people say that, but then they don't shop in those places, which is why they've gone downhill. So it's quite hard to say, well, you can't expect loads of businesses to buy those sites because then people don't go there anymore. But well, you can use those places. You can use town centres for civic amenities. There's been some great examples of building health facilities in town centres as opposed to big outside town hospitals as a way of bringing people into the town centre again, increasing NHS use, increasing diagnostic treatments, making it easier for people, things like that. So there are things that mayors, that local government could do if it had the resources, if it had the power, if it could use taxes to do that kind of thing that would make a big difference. Trying to do it from the centre and having endless kind of town fund schemes as we've had for like 20 years now just clearly isn't working as
Mm.
a way of solving that problem. And crime is similar, right? There is this perception. I thought your piece, Martin, on crime was really interesting. We sort of stop gaslighting us about crime statistics because even though, yes, crime has, according to all the statistics, decreased a lot since the 1990s, it's not how it feels to a lot of people. And a lot of that is actually about really low level, minor stuff that without that much money and that much investment, you could fix. But it's not the big system change. It's not the big dramatic reform. So people find it boring and don't want to do it. But it would make such a big difference to the mood of the country, I think, if you were able to do some of that stuff.
The obvious but slightly mean follow-up, which is, well, therefore, what actually would you put top of the list if you were picking small things that would make a big potential difference and maybe start getting the public to believe
Mm.
that good things can happen again? What are maybe some of the small or the quick wins or the cheap wins,
Yeah.
however you want to frame it, that you might look
So
for?
one of the things I sort of said in a recent post, I was arguing against the sort of idea that is now commonplace on the sort of right, that the country is a sort of total basket case and on the verge of civil war. You know, so but we are not fundamentally a broken country. There is a lot that is good about this country and a lot that actually works much better than you look at like 1970s or something. I would argue things were a lot worse then. But
I wasn't alive then,
well,
so that was
no,
terrible.
yeah, I wasn't either, so, you can just imagine it was worse. My dad tells me it was pretty miserable. But if you could fix a couple of these smaller things and show improvement was possible under the existing system, I think you would be able to combat that much more effectively. So I did in that piece talk about, Labour have this neighbourhood policing policy. I think it's broadly the right thing to do. They just haven't put enough money behind it, and police forces saying we're not going to be able to do this. They got one of the tougher settlements in the spending review. So just like we're going to put taxes up
Mm.
anyway at the budget. That's we know that's going to happen. Put them up enough that we can put literally 1 or 2 billion into making neighbourhood policing work because we know that there's a good evidence base behind it and it would reduce antisocial behaviour. As we've done it before, we did it in the 2000s. The Blair government did it in the 2000s, so we know it could be done. So that would be one of the things I'd do, definitely. But then I think decentralisation is really important because I don't know what, Scunthorpe or, need. Nobody in Westminster does. It needs to be power at a more local level to be able to make the decision about where the money goes and how much money you're spending on different projects to revitalise local areas.
So it's really interesting that you mentioned the sort of doomerist narrative there that's being pushed by the sort of uglier sides
Mm.
of the right, the people I think are the skull measurers of the right, who seem to think Britain is irrevocably broken, as you say. That's really interesting because one of the other pushbacks on the abundance critique that I've heard made, I don't think by you, but by other people, including members of parliament, is that I guess their fear is that the abundance critique implicitly accepts some of the criticisms from that view, in terms of things are broken, we need some fundamental reforms, Britain needs a kick up the arse. So, how can we, do you think, as people who, you know, want these abundant outcomes, we want abundant energy, we want abundant transport, abundant housing, and so on. Do you think we can make this argument on a sort of political level without legitimizing, some of literally the worst people in the
Yeah,
world?
well, we certainly don't want to leave it to the right to own the argument, right? It shouldn't be the case that in order to think that we should have more energy and more housing, you also have to want to, deport brown people. So we should be able to separate those two things in political discourse and make the case for them. But to go back to my sort of initial sort of critique of abundance, I do think this is why having a theory of regulation is so critical, because the right have pushed deregulation really hard for a long time and have had some success in doing that, particularly in the States. And look, that's had some very negative effects on individuals and communities because they don't care about having good regulation. They just want to get rid of it altogether. So there has to be, and to be fair to the authors of Abundance and Why Nothing Works, they do acknowledge this. And they do say you don't want the kind of right-wing version of deregulation, but then you have to have your own version of deregulation that says, well, these are the protections we do need to keep in order to ensure this is a equitable enough way forward of proceeding. This doesn't trash the environment. This doesn't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's, in order to separate the two positions, it's really critical to say what you think is necessary as well as what you think is too much or has gone too far.
And I think that's the challenge, right? Because the danger is then we just become mired in an endless debate about which specific regulation would
Yeah.
you remove or which one would you add. And I guess what we're lacking is a system of regulation or a theory of
Yeah.
regulation that can help that. And to some extent, a dynamism around it as well is one of the issues here, that we implement something, it's then there for all time effectively. We don't really have the same kind of mechanisms to review things and change things as we go along.
Yeah, and one of the challenges of regulation, and again, I think this is a particularly bad in the UK and US, because of the nature of our legal systems, is there's never any incentive for central government to give any subjective powers to regulators. It all has to be done by very tight rules so that everyone's treated the same way and you can avoid legal challenge where possible, or when legal challenge happens, you've got the best chance of winning. Whereas if the more subjective you get in your decision making, the harder that is to justify. But if you think about it in terms of, say, a very different kind of policy area, the welfare system, one of the reasons why it's so hard to reform disability benefits is they keep trying to do it through national sets of rules, and you cannot create national sets of rules around disability that will apply effectively in every case. It would be much better to have a system in which local agents had more discretion over giving out money and benefits. But the moment you do that, you're in a legal nightmare. So how do you balance this need for sort of common sense and the ability for regulators to make subjective decisions and a legal system that prioritizes objectivity? And again, I think that is much more true of the UK, US legal systems than you see in other countries.
Moving on to a somewhat different subject, but related, the growing consensus, and you've alluded to it already, is that come the autumn, Labour will inevitably have to raise taxes. It needs to happen. Effectively, we can't continue scraping along the bottom and trying to, eke out tiny fractions of a percentage each time. We need to make big strategic decisions. Intellectually, I 100% agree and understand that and accepts that. Emotionally, that's insane. How how do we kind of bridge the gulf between those two things? And I guess my real question is not just how do you raise taxes without triggering all sorts of riots and reform councils and God knows what else, but how do you build an argument around raising taxes and the necessity to do it? Because for me, it feels like there should be some kind of quid pro quo where if the government's going to say, right, we're going to increase taxes by X amount, there has to be some kind of big offer or statement to the public that justifies that or backs it up, that isn't just going back to, well, actually, Britain's still broken and it turns out we needed to do even more. How do you start to frame that, do you
Yeah, I
think,
think it's
at the risk of making you solve a
well,
massive
no, I mean
problem on behalf of the government?
it is a massive issue. I say they're going to have to because I can't see any other way out of it. Obviously, like everybody else, I'd rather not have my taxes raised. So it's not an emotional preference for me either. But I just don't see that they're going to have any choice. I think they're going to have a sort of minus headroom of somewhere between 20 and 40 billion pounds, and
Mm.
you cannot. fill that through spending cuts. There just isn't the time to do them well, even if you could think of ones to do well. And a lot of the more obvious ones that you could do, they're not prepared to touch for political reasons. So it has to come from taxes. My worry is that what they do is say, well, we need to fill this hole of £20 billion. We'll raise £20 billion. And that's
Yeah.
it. I think that would be a huge mistake, because then you're going to the country and saying, we're screwing you over again. We're asking you for more money and you're getting nothing for it. We're literally just filling a hole the OBR have told us about. That is a pretty grim message to go out with. You'd be much better off saying, we're going to raise taxes by £30 billion, which is more painful, but we've got £10 billion to do something useful with, and we're going to go for really solid, visible pledges that we can then return to over and over again. And I think crime should be one of them, which we've already talked about. I think you have to do one on health, because health is by far the biggest priority for public spending for voters. But you pick 3-4 really clear priorities, you put the money towards that, so people think they're getting something for it. Because I think if you just raise taxes and people think they're not getting anything for it, you really will play into the reform kind of they're just wasting money argument big time. But even doing what I've just said, it's still going to be unpopular. We shouldn't pretend it's not going to be. There's no way of doing it. They've got themselves into a hole, particularly by promising not to raise taxes, most of the taxes at the election, and whatever they do is going to be unpopular. But I just don't think they're going to have any choice.
On a slightly more cheerful note, Sam, so your father's Lawrence Freedman, the eminent historian, academic, godfather of strategy, one would say. When are you going to do the Civilization live stream that we've all been asking for quite some time now?
I want to do it. I love Civilization. I played it. It was one of the games I played obsessively when I was younger, and I'm no longer allowed to play for productivity reasons. But I have yet to persuade my father to get into gaming, sadly. I mean, he may be now too old, but I would love to see him just nuke the hell out of some Civilization next to him in a fit of rage after playing it for 3 days.
I think it would cheer us all up.
Sam, on that note, everyone should go out and read your book if they've not already. I'm sure most of our listeners are already familiar, but Failed State, go and buy it now. We'll put links to all your work on abundancepod.com. But for now, Sam Freedman, thank you very much. So, Martin, we're just about done for another week. How do you think it's gone?
I'll be honest, it's not been a classic Martin week this week, but I've muddled through, and hopefully I'll be back on form next week.
With a promise like that, I'm sure everyone will be back to listen next week. So in the meantime, do check out our Substacks. Links to both of us are on abundancepod.com. Do check out the paper I mentioned. Do check out Sam Freedman's Substack. I mean, I'm pretty sure everyone listening probably already subscribes, but if you don't, what are you doing? Go and read Sam. But yeah, for now, tune in next week where we'll have some more nerdy chats. So for now, thanks for listening.
See you next week.
You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
Sorry, I was miles away. Let's start that again, and this time I'll try and be mentally prepared to say my name.